Take a look at a map of Africa, and you will notice something strange. Many of its borders are perfectly straight, long, clean lines slicing across deserts, rivers, and mountains, as if someone drew them with a ruler. Because that is exactly what happened. Almost half of Africa's borders are straight lines, the highest of any continent on Earth. But these lines were not drawn by Africans. They were drawn thousands of kilometers away by men who had never set foot on the land. And that single decision still shapes the lives of over 1 billion people today. To understand why this is so strange, look at the rest of the world. Most borders follow nature. They trace the path of a river, the ridge of a mountain range, the edge of a coastline. They bend and curve because the land itself bends and curves. And they often follow people too, the places where one language fades and another begins. But Africa's straight lines ignore all of that. They cut across rivers, they split mountains, they slice straight through the territory of peoples who had lived there for centuries. So how did an entire continent end up carved into such unnatural shapes? Before the Europeans came, Africa was not empty. It was not a blank map waiting to be filled. It was home to thousands of distinct societies, powerful kingdoms, trading empires, roughly 2,000 different ethnic and language groups, each with its own land, its own rulers, its own identity. By some estimates, there were close to 10,000 separate African states and polities, a continent rich, complex, and already deeply organized. But to the powers of Europe, none of that mattered. To them, Africa was simply a prize to be divided. In the late 1800s, Europe grew hungry for rubber, gold, diamonds, ivory, and land. The Industrial Revolution demanded raw materials, and Africa was overflowing with them. Suddenly, European nations were racing one another to claim as much of the continent as they could. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, each one planting flags, signing deals, and grabbing territory before its rivals could. Historians call this the Scramble for Africa, and it was about to get dangerously out of control. Because when great powers race for the same land, it usually ends in war. To avoid that war, the powers of Europe sat down together. In the winter of 1884, representatives of 14 nations gathered in Berlin, hosted by the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Their goal was simple: to agree on the rules for dividing Africa peacefully among themselves. For months they talked, negotiated, and bargained over a giant map of the continent. But in that room, something was missing. Not a single African was present. An entire continent was being carved up, and the people who actually lived there were never asked, never invited, never even informed. Now, here is a common myth, that every African border was drawn in that single room in Berlin. The truth is a little different. Berlin set the rules of the game. It declared that to claim a piece of Africa, a European power had to actually occupy it. And that rule lit the fuse. Over the next few decades, the powers of Europe drew their borders through hundreds of separate treaties, often using rulers and lines of latitude and longitude on maps that were half empty. They drew straight lines simply because it was easy. Quick deals between diplomats, far from the land itself, and they had almost no idea what or who those lines were cutting through. And what those lines cut through were people. Communities that had lived together for generations suddenly found a border running through the middle of their land. Families on one side, their fields on the other. At least 177 distinct ethnic groups were split apart by these new borders. The Somali people, for example, were divided across 5 different countries. And it worked the other way too. Rival groups with different languages, religions, and histories were forced together inside the same new nation, told overnight that they were now one country. It was a recipe for tension that would last for generations. The consequences were devastating. When you draw a country's borders with no regard for the people inside them, you build a nation on a fault line. Groups that never chose to live together were now forced to share one government, one army, one set of resources. And groups that had always been united were now scattered across rival states. In the decades that followed, many of Africa's conflicts, its civil wars, its struggles for power, can be traced back, at least in part, to these arbitrary lines. Borders that were never designed to hold a nation together, only to divide a continent between foreigners. Then, in the 1960s, everything changed. One after another, African nations broke free and won their independence. The colonizers were leaving at last. And here, those new African leaders faced an extraordinary choice. They could tear up the colonial borders and redraw the map the way it should have been, or they could keep the lines exactly as they were. In 1964, they made their decision. The Organization of African Unity agreed to respect the borders inherited from colonial rule. Not because the lines were fair, but because they feared that redrawing them could plunge the entire continent into endless war. And so, those straight lines remain. The same borders drawn by European diplomats over a century ago still define more than 50 nations today. They still split peoples apart, they still force rivals together, and they still lie at the root of many of the tensions across the continent. It is one of the most powerful examples in all of history of how a few lines drawn on a map by distant hands can shape the destiny of a billion people long after the men who drew them are gone. So the next time you look at a map of Africa and you see those long, unnatural straight lines, remember what they really are. Not natural boundaries, not the choices of the people who live there, but the fading fingerprints of an empire, pressed permanently into the map of a continent. Geography did not draw Africa's borders. Power did. If you want to understand the world this way, through the maps that quietly shape history, subscribe to Atlas Untold, because every border has a story, and most of them are still untold.